She was 9 years old. She weighed 60 pounds. She had 7 boxes of mints, a dog named Shep, and a grandmother who had just given her an oatmeal cookie. On the afternoon of March 6, 1959, she stepped out of her front door excited and never came back through it. For 62 years, nobody knew his name. Not one tip. Not one witness. Not one report. He walked those same streets. He searched alongside grieving neighbors. He sat beside a crying little girl who had no idea she was weeping in front of the man who had just murdered her campfire sister. And when he died, he took the secret with him into the ground and was buried just yards away from his own victim for 51 years. This is the story of Candy Rogers. And the glass jar that refused to let her be forgotten. If this case already has you leaning forward, you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Hit that subscribe button right now and drop a candle in the comments, because before this story is over, you are going to need somewhere to put everything you are feeling. This is Midnight Crime. We do not stop until we find the truth. Spokane, Washington in 1959 was the kind of city that no longer exists. Not in the way people mean when they say things were simpler back than they genuinely were, at least in west-central Spokane. It was a working-class neighborhood. Modest homes pressed together on familiar streets. Faces that knew each other by name. Children walked to school alone every single morning. Neighbors left their front doors unlocked because there was no reason not to. Nobody watched the clock when kids went outside to play. The idea that something could happen to them in their own neighborhood, on their own street, was not something people spent energy worrying about. There was simply no reason to. Candy Rogers lived in an apartment above a neighborhood grocery store on the 2000 block of West Mission Avenue with her mother, Elaine, who was a high school history and physical education teacher. Her grandparents lived right next door. She had a dog named Shep. She was small for her age, 4 feet and 4 inches tall, 60 pounds, quiet and shy by nature. But she was a bluebird. The junior level of Campfire Girls of America. And that membership meant the world to her. It gave her something concrete to work toward. Something she could earn. Something that was hers. March 6 of 1959 was the very first day of the campfire mint selling season. Candy got out of school at 3:15 in the afternoon. By 3:30, she was already at her troop leader's house picking up her boxes. She had a plan worked out. She was going to sell enough mints to earn her sales badge, and if she did well enough, she would be in the running for a free week of summer camp. She could only carry 7 boxes. She was too small for more. She brought them home and waited for 4 o'clock, the official start time. In that half hour of waiting, she sat with her grandmother and ate an oatmeal cookie. She played with Shep. She talked about which neighbors she was going to visit first, who would definitely buy, who might need a little convincing. She was not nervous. She was not anxious. She was excited. Completely, genuinely excited. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Candy Rogers stepped out into the cold March air and started knocking on doors. In the Pacific Northwest in early March, darkness falls quickly. By 5:40 in the evening, the streetlights were already coming on. Candy knew the rule. Be home before the lights came on. So when 5:30 passed with no sign of her, her grandfather went outside to look. He checked the neighbors. He walked the block. He asked around. Nobody had seen her recently. Her mother, Elaine, arrived home from a hair appointment and found the apartment empty. Within the hour, family members were moving through the streets calling her name. By nightfall, the police had been called. The search was immediately complicated by a detail that nobody could have anticipated. There were dozens of other campfire girls out that same evening, little girls in the same uniforms, carrying the same boxes of mints, knocking on the same kinds of doors in the same neighborhood. Witnesses thought they had seen Candy. But they could not be certain which child they had actually seen. Every lead doubled back on itself. Every sighting dissolved into uncertainty. And then, around 9 o'clock that night, searchers found something that changed the nature of everything. On Pettit Drive, a road that climbs a hill the locals had long called Doomsday Hill, boxes of campfire mints were scattered across the ground. Not dropped carelessly. Not left behind by a child in a hurry. Scattered. Some of them looked as though they had been thrown from a moving car window as someone sped away. The trail of boxes led south, across the Fort George Wright Bridge, away from Candy's neighborhood and towards somewhere else entirely. One of the boxes had a partial fingerprint on it. The print was carefully lifted, preserved, and sent to the FBI. It was never identified. By 9 o'clock on the night of March 6, 1959, the city of Spokane understood one thing with a cold and terrible clarity. Candy Rogers had not wandered off. She had not gotten lost. She had not simply forgotten the time. Someone had taken her. And whoever that person was, they were already gone. By the morning of March 7, every person in Spokane knew her name. And more than 1,200 of them showed up to find her. 1,200 people for one little girl. Marines. Boy Scouts. Utility workers. Mail carriers. Horseback riders. All of them descended on west central Spokane before sunrise. A command post was established at the intersection of Pettit Drive and the T.J. Minnick Bridge, right where her mint boxes had been found scattered across the road. The United States Air Force sent helicopters for aerial coverage. They had no cell phones. No GPS. No surveillance cameras. No digital records of any kind. They had scattered mint boxes, one unidentified fingerprint, and a trail that ended at the edge of a bridge over a river. On March 7, just one day after Candy disappeared, a United States Air Force helicopter flying low over the search area struck high-tension power lines and crashed into the Spokane River. 3 crew members were killed. Airman Merles D. Ray, Staff Sergeant William F. McDonald, and Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fout. 2 others survived. 3 men died searching for one little girl. The city was now grieving in 2 directions at the same time. And Candy had still not been found. The days that followed were silent in the worst possible way. Tips flooded in from across the country. Hundreds, then thousands of them. Detectives followed every lead they could. They contacted anyone with a relevant criminal history. In 1959, there was no sex offender registry. No centralized database. No way to quickly cross-reference violent offenders across state lines. Several suspects were developed. None could be tied to Candy's disappearance with anything more than suspicion. 16 days went by. On March 21, 2 airmen from Fairchild Air Force Base were hunting in the woods off Old Trails Road, about 7 miles from Candy's home. Moving through the trees near an abandoned rock quarry, they noticed something resting against a tree. A pair of small girls' shoes. Placed there deliberately. Not dropped in a hurry. Just left. They returned to base and reported what they had found. The next morning, a search party arrived at the site at daybreak. Within minutes, one of the searchers pushed aside a pile of brush and pine needles and found Candy Rogers. She had been buried under branches and dead tree boughs, about 50 yards off the road. Retired Spokane Police Captain Richard Obering was one of the officers who found her that morning. He would carry the image of what he saw for the rest of his life. And he would still be alive, 62 years later, on the day the man responsible was finally named. The cause of death was strangulation. The weapon was a strip of cloth torn from Candy's own slip, the garment she had been wearing when she left home that Friday afternoon to sell mints and earn her badge. Her feet were bound with another strip of the same slip. A mark around her waist suggested she may have been restrained with a rope at some point during her ordeal, but no rope was recovered at the scene. Medical examiners found evidence of a deeper violation, one that added a layer of horror to the crime that the investigators carried silently and professionally for decades. Every piece of evidence was carefully catalogued and preserved. The investigators in 1959 had no concept of what future technology would one day be able to extract from biological material. They could not have known. But they preserved everything anyway. And that quiet act of care, that professional instinct to hold on to what little they had, was going to matter more than any of them could have possibly imagined. The discovery of Candy's body changed Spokane in ways that lasted for generations. Parents who had never thought twice about letting children walk alone now watched from windows. They set strict rules. They told their children the story of the little girl who went out to sell mints and never came home. The case became part of how Spokane families raised their children for decades afterward. A warning passed from one generation to the next. A name that everyone in that city knew. Police had evidence. They had a DNA sample they did not yet know how to use. They had hoped that science would eventually hand them an answer. But before that could happen, a serial killer was about to walk directly into the investigation and send everyone chasing in entirely the wrong direction for the next 40 years. For 4 decades, Spokane detectives believed they knew exactly who had killed Candy Rogers. They had a name. They had a history. They had a piece of evidence that seemed to point directly and unmistakably at one man. For 40 years, that case felt solid. It was completely wrong. And here is what makes it worse. The real killer had never appeared in a single tip. Not a single witness statement. Not a single police report. Not in 62 years of active investigation. While detectives spent 40 of those years focused on the wrong man, the real one lived quietly in the same city, raised a family, went to work, and died before anyone ever thought to look at him. His name was Hugh Bain Morse. He was a member of the Spokane Motorcycle Club, the kind of man who moved through the community without raising a single alarm. When Candy went missing, he showed up to help with the search. He walked those streets alongside grieving neighbors and determined officers, looking for a little girl he almost certainly already knew was dead. He lived just a couple of blocks from Candy's home. And 4 years before her murder, in California, he had been picked up for attempting to molest 2 Girl Scouts who were selling cookies door to door. A chilling echo of exactly what had happened to Candy. Less than a year after Candy's body was found, Morse raped and murdered 2 women in Spokane, then continued across the country, committing at least 7 more violent crimes before being caught in Minnesota in 1961 after a neighbor recognized him from an FBI wanted poster. He died in a Minnesota prison in April of 2003, serving 2 life sentences. The profile fit Candy's case almost perfectly. He preyed on young girls selling things door to door. He was in the area. And then there was the gum. Hugh Morse had a known habit. At almost every crime scene attributed to him, investigators found grape-flavored gum. It was consistent enough across multiple locations that it became a documented detail, one of those quietly damning threads that connects a killer to his crimes. During Candy's autopsy in 1959, a detective noted a stain on her clothing. Purple in color. And when examined closely, it had a smell that resembled grape. That single observation took on a life of its own inside the investigation. As Morse's profile as a serial killer became clearer over the years, that stain became the centerpiece of the circumstantial case against him. It was never tested. Never proven. It was an assumption that slowly hardened into near certainty over time, and it pointed every subsequent investigation in entirely the wrong direction for 4 decades. Then came 2001. Detective Mindy Connolly submitted Candy's clothing to a forensic laboratory. Scientists isolated a semen sample from the preserved evidence and built a full DNA profile, the first time in 42 years that investigators had anything beyond circumstantial suspicion. Something concrete. Something testable. They tested it against Hugh Morse. It did not match. The grape stain. The parallel crimes. The geography. The timing. None of it mattered. The DNA said no. The profile was uploaded to Cody's the National DNA Database. 0 hits. Complete silence. The real killer had never been arrested for anything that required a DNA sample to be entered into the database. He had never surfaced as a person of interest. In 62 years, his name had not appeared once, not in a tip, not in a report, not anywhere. He had been right there the whole time. And nobody had ever looked at him. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment and type "still here," because what comes next is the part that changes everything, and we want to know who is truly following this story all the way to the answer that took 62 years to arrive. There is one reason and only one reason that this case was ever solved. It was not the detectives, though they never gave up. It was not the technology, though it ultimately delivered the answer. It was not the laboratory in Texas, though they did what no one else could do. All of those things mattered enormously. But none of them would have worked without a single decision made by an unknown investigator in 1959, long before DNA testing existed, long before anyone understood what genetic material could someday reveal. Someone put Candy's underwear in a glass mason jar and sealed it shut. That is the thread that connects a 9-year-old girl murdered in 1959 to a confirmed DNA match in 2021. Glass does not degrade. Glass does not absorb moisture. It does not interact chemically with what is stored inside it. That airtight seal made in an era with absolutely no reason to think about genetic evidence created a near-perfect preservation environment. When forensic scientists finally opened that jar in the early 2000s, the DNA inside was not merely present. It was strong enough to build a full profile from. The investigators in 1959 could not have known what they were saving. But they saved it anyway. Brittany Wright grew up in Spokane. As a child, her parents told her about Candy Rogers not as a news story, not as a historical footnote, but as a warning. Watch where you go. Remember what happened to that little girl. The case was woven deeply into how Spokane parents raised their children for decades after the crime itself. The name Candy Rogers carried weight in that city the way certain stories carry weight, not because people chose to remember them, but because they never quite left. Wright grew up to become a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory Division. And in 2018, when the Spokane Police Department began reassessing its cold cases, Candy's file landed on her desk. The timing was not random. In 2018, California investigators used a then-new technique called forensic genetic genealogy to identify the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who had evaded capture for 40 years. The technique worked by running crime scene DNA through consumer ancestry databases to find distant relatives of the unknown suspect. Genealogists then built out family trees, narrowing and narrowing the field until they landed on a single name. The moment that arrest made international news, law enforcement agencies across the country pulled out their oldest, most stubborn cold cases and asked one question. Could this work for us? Spokane asked that question about Candy immediately. There was a serious problem. The DNA sample, while remarkably well preserved compared to what it could have been, thanks to that sealed glass jar, had still degraded over 60 years of time. It was also contaminated with non-human biological material, which complicated the analysis further. In 2020, Wright submitted the sample to a private genealogy laboratory. They examined it. And they sent it back. Too degraded, they said. They declined the case. That rejection was close to the end of the road. Cody's had returned nothing. Every traditional investigative lead had long been exhausted. If genetic genealogy could not be performed with what remained, the investigation was effectively finished. There was nowhere left to go. Then Wright heard about a laboratory in Texas called Othram. Othram specializes in precisely the kind of work that other laboratories turn away. They had developed a proprietary method called forensic-grade genome sequencing built from the ground up specifically for degraded, contaminated, or near-depleted biological samples. The kind of samples other labs look at and walk away from. In February of 2021, Wright described the sample to them. She told them what they were working with. How old it was. How little remained. They said they could try. She packaged up what remained of the evidence by her own description. She was down to the very last drops of material and she sent it to Texas. Othram went to work. Weeks passed. And then Othram finished. They had built a genealogical profile and run it through an ancestry database. The results had narrowed the field considerably down to 3 brothers. All of them deceased. All of them from Spokane. John Ray Hoff. James Andrew Hoff. Terry Allen Hoff. Genetic genealogy cannot distinguish between brothers. Their DNA looks nearly identical when you are building out a family tree from a distant relative match. To identify which one of the 3 had left his DNA on Candy's clothing, investigators needed a living relative. A child. Someone who shared direct biological descent from one of those brothers and only one. Only one of the 3 men had children. Only one path forward existed. Detective Stormont picked up the phone and called a woman who had spent her entire life believing her father had died because he struggled with depression. That was the story her family had carried for decades. The way they had made sense of a painful and confusing loss. She had no idea what was about to happen to that story. In 62 years of investigation, John Ray Hoff's name had never appeared in a single police report. Not as a suspect. Not as a witness. Not as a passing mention in the background of any lead. Detective Stormont said it plainly at the press conference that followed. He was not on their radar at all until September 6, 2021. That was the day everything changed. When Stormont called Kathy Hoff, he identified himself as a cold case investigator who needed her help with a case he was working on. He did not tell her what case. Within 45 minutes of that phone call, she was at Spokane Police Headquarters. But she already knew. She had not waited passively after a mysterious call from a detective who would not tell her what it was about. She had gone online. She had searched. Somewhere in those 45 minutes between the phone call and the moment she walked through the door of the police station, she had found the story of a 9-year-old girl murdered in Spokane in 1959 while selling campfire mints door to door in her neighborhood. She walked into that police station already carrying the weight of what she suspected. Kathy volunteered her DNA without hesitation. The results came back on September 8, 2021. The DNA recovered from Candy's clothing was 2.9 million times more likely to be related to Kathy than to any random person from the general population. Her father was the man who had left that DNA. The man who had taken Candy Rogers. But investigators were not done. John Hoff was deceased. There would be no trial. No cross-examination. No defense attorney. No moment in a courtroom where the law looked him in the eye and named what he was. That meant the burden of certainty rested entirely on the investigators themselves. They needed to be as sure as science could possibly make them before they said his name publicly and permanently attached it to what he had done. They obtained a warrant and exhumed John Ray Hoff's body on September 23, 2021. The result came back on October 1. The probability that the DNA from Candy's clothing belonged to Hoff rather than to some unrelated person was 25 quintillion to 1. The number 25 followed by 18 zeros. A number so large it does not exist in any ordinary frame of human reference. A number that does not leave room for doubt. Not a single molecule of it. The case was solved. John Ray Hoff was born on August 11, 1938, in Spokane. His own hometown. He grew up on the 2500 block of West College Avenue. He was not a drifter passing through. He was local. He was known. His face was familiar. His early life bore the warning signs that, looked at in hindsight, form a recognizable and terrible pattern. In 1955, at 16 years old, he escaped from a state juvenile reform facility near Olympia and was caught near Yakima. That brush with the law pushed him toward the military. He joined the United States Army at 17 and was assigned to Nike missile sites protecting Fairchild Air Force Base right outside Spokane, right back in his own city. On March 6, 1959, the day Candy Rogers stepped out of her apartment at 4 o'clock in the afternoon carrying 7 boxes of campfire mints, John Ray Hoff lived at 221 West Broadway Avenue. Candy's home was on the 2200 block of West Mission Avenue. 1 mile apart. In 1961, 2 years after Candy's murder, Hoff was arrested in West Spokane. The charge was second-degree assault. What he had done was this. He grabbed a woman, forcibly removed her clothing, tied her up using strips of her own garments, and strangled her before fleeing. She survived only because something interrupted him before he could finish. Read that again. He used his victim's own clothing to bind her. He used her own clothing to strangle her. That is an exact match to what was done to Candy Rogers. The ligature around Candy's neck was torn from her own slip. Her ankles were bound with another strip of the same garment. The 1961 victim survived only because something interrupted him. Candy did not. Hoff served 6 months. 6 months for what he did to that woman. As a result of that conviction, the Army declared him a deserter and dishonorably discharged him. He drifted between jobs after that, selling cutlery door to door, working at a lumber yard, putting time in at a meatpacking plant where he suffered a chemical burn on his face. He was not a man building toward anything. He was a man with no direction and no accountability, and a violence inside him that had already taken one life and nearly taken another. And then there is the detail about John Ray Hoff that cuts deeper than all the others. He had a stepsister. She was 10 years old in 1959. And she was a campfire girl. She was Candy Rogers' assigned big sister in the campfire program, the older girl whose role was to guide and mentor and look out for the younger bluebird. She knew Candy. She cared about Candy. When Candy disappeared and the city of Spokane fell apart searching for her, this girl was devastated. She sat next to her brother next to John Hoff and she cried. She told him how much she missed her little campfire sister. She told him how terrible it was. How much it hurt. How scared she was. He sat there and listened and said nothing. John Ray Hoff died in 1970 before anyone could ever hold him accountable for anything he had done to Candy Rogers. He shot himself in the head. The date he chose was his daughter's birthday. The day she turned 9 years old. The same age Candy Rogers had been when he raped and murdered her. Whether that date was chosen out of guilt, or whether it was a coincidence. Or whether it was something far darker that defies easy explanation, he took that answer with him into the ground. And when investigators went to locate exactly where he had been buried, they discovered something that made the room go quiet. For 51 years, John Ray Hoff was buried in the same cemetery as Candy Rogers. The little girl he abducted on a cold Friday afternoon. The child he strangled with her own clothing after tying her feet with strips of the same slip she had put on that morning, excited about selling mints. She was buried there. And so was he. Just yards away, in the same ground, in the same silence, in the same city for over 5 decades. While her family visited her grave and stood over her headstone and wondered, year after year, who had done this to their little girl, her killer lay in the same earth, and nobody knew. His name had never once entered the investigation. Not once in 62 years. When Detective Stormont told Hoff's surviving family what the DNA had confirmed, he described it at the press conference this way. He said that he had taken those people's lives and their childhood and dumped everything on its head. He was not being dramatic. He was being precise. Kathy Hoff had spent her entire life believing her father had died because he struggled with depression. That was the story her family had constructed to explain a painful and confusing loss. And in one phone call from a cold case detective, that story was demolished and replaced by something no amount of preparation could have softened. The grief did not disappear. It became something far more complicated than grief. When the family learned that he was buried in the same cemetery as Candy Rogers, they made a decision without being asked. They arranged to have his remains moved to a different cemetery so that Candy, as Detective Stormont put it at the press conference, could enjoy some peace. When Candy's family heard that, her cousin Joanne was overcome with emotion. That gesture from the killer's family to the victim's family was not justice. It could never be justice. But it was the only thing they had the power to give, and they gave it without hesitation. There is still the matter of Hoff's stepsister. She is in her 70s now. After the case was publicly solved, Stormont tracked her down and told her what her brother had done. She was, in his words, absolutely heartbroken. She remembered sitting beside John Hoff. She remembered crying. She remembered telling him how devastated she was, how much she missed her little campfire sister, how wrong and terrible and senseless it all was. He had sat there. He had listened. And he had said nothing. She had spent her entire life carrying that grief as an innocent bystander, never knowing that the person responsible for all of it was sitting right beside her, absorbing her tears without flinching, without speaking, without giving anything away. Kathy Hoff gave a videotaped statement that was played at the press conference on November 19. She did not hide from it. She did not deflect. She looked into the camera and she said, "I am very, very sorry for what my dad did. That he took her life horribly. I hope that it gives her peace knowing that even though it is not really justice, because he does not get any punishment, his name has this on it now. And they can know it is solved." That statement is worth sitting with for a moment. There would be no trial. There would be no sentencing. There would be no courtroom moment where the law looked John Ray Hoff in the eye and named what he was out loud in front of witnesses. He had already escaped all of that. He had escaped it by dying in 1970 on his daughter's 9th birthday. But Kathy was offering the only thing that still remained available. Acknowledgement. His name attached permanently and publicly and irrevocably to what he had done to Candy Rogers. The record corrected. The truth on paper, in the official file, in the public record, forever. It is not justice. But it is not nothing. At the press conference, retired Captain Obring sat in the audience. He was one of the officers who had found Candy's body on March 22, 1959. He had pushed aside that pile of brush and pine needles and seen with his own eyes what John Hoff had left behind in those woods. He had carried that image inside him for 62 years. He was still alive on the day the answer finally arrived. "I thank God," he said, "that I lived long enough to see the end of this case." Detective Stormont, visibly emotional throughout the entire press conference, was asked how many hours had been invested in the Candy Rogers investigation across 62 years of work by 3 separate generations of investigators. He did not give a number. He said, "This is not measured in hours. This is measured in careers. 3 generations of detectives had worked this case. 3 generations had passed it forward with the same unspoken understanding: do not give up on her." The last generation did not. Candy's cousin Joanne wiped tears from her face at that press conference and said simply, "I feel like Candy's loss was just a horrible loss. She was so cute. And she didn't have much time. She didn't have much time. She didn't." Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She wanted to earn a badge. She had a dog named Shep and a grandmother who gave her oatmeal cookies on cold afternoons and a whole street full of neighbors she was excited to visit with her 7 little boxes of campfire mints. She had a future that belonged entirely to her by right, a future full of summer camps and report cards and birthday parties and all the ordinary extraordinary things that make up a life, and it was taken from her on a cold Friday afternoon in March of 1959 by a 20-year-old soldier who lived 1 mile away and was never once suspected for 62 years. We will never know who she would have become. We will never know what her life would have looked like. We can only know what she was, a small, shy, excited little girl on the first day of mint selling season, stepping out into the cold air with 7 boxes and a plan and the whole afternoon ahead of her. She mattered enough that 1,200 people showed up to find her before the sun rose on the morning after she disappeared. She mattered enough that 3 men gave their lives searching for her from the sky. She mattered enough that 3 generations of detectives refused to close her file, refused to call it unsolvable, refused to let her name become just a number in a cold case database. She mattered enough that a forensic scientist who had grown up hearing her name as a child sent one last sample to one last laboratory in Texas and refused to accept that the answer was gone forever. And she mattered enough that the daughter of her killer sat in front of a camera, looked directly into it, and made absolutely certain that the world would know her father's name and what he did with it. 62 years, 8 months, and 13 days. That is how long Candy Rogers waited. The clock has finally stopped. And here is what this case leaves behind when the lights come on and the press conference ends and the files are finally closed. How many other cold cases from the 1950s and 1960s still have biological evidence sitting in an evidence locker somewhere waiting for technology that already exists to finally give them an answer? John Hoff committed a nearly identical assault in 1961 and served just 6 months for it. 6 months. If that sentence had reflected the true danger he posed to other human beings, would Candy Rogers's case have ever needed to be solved? Would there have been a case at all? And what does it mean for justice when the only punishment a killer ever faces is having his name permanently attached to what he did long after he is already gone? If this story has stayed with you, if Candy Rogers's name is sitting in your chest the way it should be, then do something with that feeling right now. Like this video so that more people find it. Subscribe to Midnight Crime so you never miss a case we bring to light. And leave a comment below, tell us what part of this story hit you hardest, or simply drop her name. Candy Rogers. Say it out loud. Because that is how we make sure she is never forgotten again. We will keep uncovering the truth behind these cases as long as you keep watching. And the links to more solved cold cases are waiting for you in the description below. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. And good night from Midnight Crime.